Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. This podcast is for you if you're a musician or audio engineer looking to create pro-level recordings and mixes from your home studio. My name is Mike Indovina. Let's get started. Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Adam Greenspan, and if you're not familiar with him, he is a producer and engineer who has worked with artists such as Arcade Fire, Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Supergrass, Faith No More, Refused, Block Party, Flogging Molly, and so many more. And in this episode, we cover a lot of ground, including Adam's journey of rising up the studio ranks, becoming a head engineer, and then actually going back a step and becoming a runner once he moved. And typically, with most people in this industry, the goal is to become a head engineer. And for most people, once they actually achieve that, they want to stay put there. They don't want to go back a step. But Adam made some choices to actually take a step back, which then created more opportunities, which then created an even more fruitful career. So it's a really interesting story to hear him talk about that journey and how it all came together. And then we also get into some other great stuff about pushing the boundaries of an artist and how to find the real gold within their takes, and sometimes even playing off of some of their insecurities, but using them as a superpower for the band and how to showcase and highlight those things. So we talk about that. We talk about how to make your mixes sound more 3D and create width and depth. And he's got an interesting approach to using effects. And he shares a lot about the effects that he likes to use and some of the techniques he likes to use as well. He even gets into some really cool tips as it relates to how to get creative with room mics and really make a small room transform into something much bigger. So yeah, there's a ton of really cool stuff in this episode. I think you're going to really enjoy it. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Adam Greenspan, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. What's going on, man?
Hey, how's it going, man?
Doing great.
Just here in LA in my studio, Slam Dance Cosmopolis
Nice.
On the east side of LA. Yeah.
Right on, man. Well, for people who might not be familiar with you or your work, can you give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into the music industry and what you're working on these days?
Yeah, I'm a producer, mixer, engineer, live in LA. I've been making records for about 30 years now. It blows my mind how quickly time has flown by. Originally from Atlanta, but I've been based here in LA since '97. Got my start in San Francisco at a residential studio called Razor's Edge, which was a really fantastic experience to be living in a recording studio at age 20.
Nice.
And yeah, just a really fantastic place to get hands-on, right after school, as opposed to coming straight to LA where, you're like making coffee for people for like 5 years. Just sort of, met a small independent studio owner and was a fan of records that they had made there. And this is all like from going through backs of CD covers and stuff, didn't really have the internet as we know it today at that time to just, search easily and contact people. So, it took a little bit of boots on the ground and going through phone books, literally. I was there for about 2 years. I eventually became head engineer, studio manager, owner, toured with his band, in Europe quite a bit. So, at a very young age, I was just literally left in control of a recording studio and got to work with all kinds of people at that time. I ended up engineering an album for Faith No More.
Right on.
I was super young. I mean, my friends were still in college. When that studio sold, it sold to a client of ours, Fat Records, Fat Mike from NoFX.
Oh,
and great people, but they were the only people who brought in their own engineer. And so, staying on would have meant a little bit of a step backwards without as much potential to move forwards again. So the logical thing to do was to come down to LA at that time and to take a little bit of a step backwards and, start back as a runner, already having engineering experience, but to start back as a runner. But I was, to be honest, I was able to fly through that pretty quick. In the 90s, there was just so much turnover in the industry. There was still so much money that, people were going freelance left and right, and you'd move up. And, it was only a few months of running before I was, full-time assistant. And this was at Westlake Audio
Nice.
Here in LA. And then did a little bit of time at the Village on the west side. Jeff Greenberg, to this day is just a great studio owner. It's such a killer place to work. But I've been freelance since about 2000.
Cool.
Yeah. And then during that time, is when I met Nick Launay, who has been my mentor, partner, good friend. Oddly enough, we met through Jared Leto, 30 Seconds to Mars. I was recording demos for him at his home studio, and he was meeting with producers, before making his first album. And Nick came by, and I was already a huge fan of his work. The record he did with Girls Against Boys is kind of what keyed me into him, but I had already heard so many records of his, before that, just had never put the name to him. I told Nick I was a big fan, if you ever needed, Pro Tools stuff, programming. And he was like, well, actually, he's quite, at the time, quite meat and potatoes, still made records on tape and didn't really know Pro Tools or anything. So he's like, I'll let you know. And then within the next 2 weeks, we just started running into each other socially, like at bars and stuff and clubs. And it's like we realized we were already in the same circles. And then it turned out the next record he did was this band called Must that was sort of this combination of kind of a rock band, but with like drum and bass kind of electronic elements. So sure enough, his next record, he needed someone to kind of wrangle the MIDI, so to speak. And so we ended up working together on that record, and we just really enjoyed working together so much that just started to find more and more ways to incorporate me into his record making process, and didn't always need those kinds of more modern workflows. So I was also kind of going back and like relearning just regular engineering tips from him. And just techniques. And, I think, up to that point, I was fairly self-taught. I mean, you kind of learn how things work in schools, but, you don't really get sounds in school. That's kind of as far as you get. You learn how to get signal flow. And as long as audio's coming in, no one really ever gives you a whole lot of like, well, actually, if you do this will make this sound good. At Full Sail at the time, there was none of that. But, it's only a year long. Mm-hmm. It's like, it takes longer than that to learn that stuff. But, so up until then, my any technique I had was sort of trial and error. And then, having a really great engineer who I specifically like his sounds, be able to kind of take me under his wing and, teach his method of record making. And we can get into kind of a lot of things about my process are still very much things that I learned from him during it's been like 25 years now of us working
That's
together.
awesome.
Almost. It's been well over 20. We've kind of lost count, and somehow I'm older than him now. But no, I am. I mean, I'm considerably older than he was when we started working together. So that's how long it's been.
Gotcha.
So, as our relationship evolved, we started working out of a residential studio here in the Valley that was called Seedy Underbelly that had belonged to a really dear friend of ours. And, so that allowed us to kind of work together full time. I was kind of built into that studio, and then I started traveling with him. And then as our relationship developed, and we had very, very complementary skill sets. I come from a musician background before an engineer, and he doesn't. So there are some musical aspects of making records that we found I was better at. Well, not better, but just more natural at.
Yeah.
Even if it was just getting a guitar sound, like he might hear a sound. He might be good at microphones, but he doesn't necessarily know what guitar and amp combination is that, like if that's the part you're looking for. And so it became so much more of a collaborative process between the two of us, all the way to the point where I ended up starting to get producing credits on albums, and then it just started to be like, well, okay, that's how we work. Like we co-produce now.
Cool.
When we work together,
That's awesome.
is as equals. And, Idols was one of it was the first record that we went into 100% as equal, because I had done most of the mixing work on the previous album. I think that everybody, was in agreement that we wanted to be structured like that, the project. And it was a really, really funny moment during the making of that record where we had a saxophone player come in one afternoon, but we were still in the middle of tracking. So, we knew the band was going to want to jump like right back into, doing another tune once we were done with the sax. And so he finishes and we're just like, okay. And I'm just like, all right, I'll go put the mics back up. You recall the channels. Like, here's the pictures in my phone. Or like, you recall that. And he's like, okay. And like, I go to walk out and we just look at each other and start laughing. Cause it was like, I had just like kind of barked an order at him. And we just both thought it was so funny, and like, he's never been an order barker. That wasn't never like the dynamic, but like, we just both thought it was so funny. Like, just all of a sudden, like, all right, you do this. And he was just like, okay.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, I would definitely love to dive a little bit deeper into your relationship with Nick, but I kind of want to take a step back because there was something you mentioned earlier that I think is something that probably is on the mind of a lot of my listeners, which is that you talked about, not being in the big city originally, and you were working out of a smaller studio, and you'd very quickly risen up the ranks there and were like head engineer. And then the idea of like having to go to LA meant that you would have had to like kind of take a step back. And for a lot of people, it's like, you have this vision of like, I'm going to just rise up the ranks and eventually I'm just going to be like the head engineer. And like, that's kind of that's the end goal. Right. But then to like think, okay, now I'm going to move to this big city where I'm going to be a small fish in a big pond. And I got to go back a step. Like, was that something that was an easy thing for you to accept? Or was it just did you feel like there was more opportunity in LA at that point? Or was it just like, this is just how it works? I just got to.
Well, yeah. I mean, there was definitely more opportunity in LA. In the mid 90s, the industry was definitely much more centralized in a few of the obvious cities. And, not to mention that San Francisco in particular, it was a very small city, and this is pre-tech boom. And, shortly after I was there wasn't even an artist population in the city. Everyone had to leave. Everyone was in the East Bay, or LA. But I mean, I'll give you kind of the long story of that is that the studio had never had an intern. The owner pretty much did everything. He had one or two guys that he could hire to engineer if he was going to be out of town or if he wasn't available for a session. But he never, ever had anybody full-time there. And it was a cool place right in the middle of the city, Divisadero and Fells. Actually, the house where Anne Rice wrote Interview with a Vampire.
Cool.
It was very much haunted. And I'm not even one to believe in that kind of shit, but I saw some shit there that couldn't explain. We'll leave it at that. Maybe have me back again around Halloween and we'll get into more of those stories.
It's a great idea. Yeah, let's do that. Studio ghost stories.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of made myself necessary, organized the studio and improved their workflow, and just found a way to kind of streamline things both as a business and just as how we operated as a studio. I mean, it came down to simple things like organizing the mic locker to where you could find stuff rather than it just being this gigantic bucket with every single microphone in there, label some shelves, so you can find things. Put a fresh coat of paint in the lounge, which literally looked like it literally was probably like a heroin den. I mean, Kurt Cobain had produced an album for the Melvins there, and we still had this leather couch that he had bought to nod off on during the making of that record. It was cool because the owner was also kind of self-taught, which in a way meant that there was less ego on his part to someone who was like right out of school, because there were things like right off the bat. We had a Trident TSM console. That's the other thing about this place. It was an analog desk, no automation, no Pro Tools, just an Otari tape machine. And so the only thing I could learn there was dialing sounds. There was There were no two tape machines to learn how to link a links together, or none of that stuff. Just get sounds on analog tape through a good sounding vintage analog desk. And, I think there was one day, so the owner was in a band with Gary Floyd from the Dicks, who sadly just passed away last week. We were making their record, was one of the first things we did. So I got to kind of work hands-on with him. And one day, we have an organ player in. And he's like, "Oh, you ever mic'd up a Leslie cabinet?" I was like, "No." He's like, "Me either. Go for it." So you know what I mean? There was no, attitude or anything. And then one day he's dropping in, with the other guitar player, and he asked me to go grab him a cup of coffee from the kitchen. And he's like, "Oh, wait a second." He's like, "Actually, that coffee that you made yesterday was terrible." He's like, "You know how to drop in, right?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Yeah, just do these overdubs. I'm gonna go get my own coffee." And he comes back in the room, and I go to get up out of the chair, and he's like, "No, sit down." And I'm like, "Cool." So, I'm driving for the rest of the day. And then he calls me the next morning. He's like, "You've got a pretty good grip on this." He's like, "I'll come in a few days and see where things are going, but you can, finish Danny's parts with him. And,
Nice.
I'll check in a few days." And then a few months later, he's on tour and he's like, "All right." He had another engineer named Tim, and I don't know what had actually gone down, but he calls me from somewhere in Eastern Europe, and he's just like, "I just fired Tim, so you run the studio now." And so that was a really great thing to be that young and to be given that responsibility. Like I said, I still lived there on premises. So, I was literally living, breathing for 2 years straight, recording. And, it was local bands. It was, like I said, Fat Records, every band that was on that label at the time. I couldn't even tell you how many and all the names. It sort of culminated, the biggest thing I did was that Faith No More record, and they had told their label wanted a name attached to the record, and they kind of didn't want that. So they told the label they were going to record demos, and they would just use the house engineer at the studio. And when we were done, they turned it in, and they said, "This is the record. You can have a name, mix it, but we have made our record."
Nice.
Yeah. And so, around the time that record came out, summer of '97, I was actually traveling around Europe for the first time. I'd made so many connections at that studio, both with the owners. He was on Glitter House, which was the European leg of Sub Pop. So, I'd made a lot of friends around Europe at that time. So kind of just did the whole backpacking thing. I was still only 21. And, that was at the time that Jonathan had decided to sell the studio, and I knew it wasn't really going to be the best option to stay on. Personally, I wasn't particularly even into that kind of music, let alone, the studio was going to become all in-house productions. So, and I had cast a bit of a net around other San Francisco studios, and it's such a small community. Everyone already knew me from the 2 years. I mean, there was only about maybe 5 or 6 studios in the whole Bay Area. Everyone knew everyone. No one needed a resume. They're like, "We know you. We don't need your resume," but we haven't hired anyone in 10 years. So, it was more you get a job as a staff engineer there, and that was a career. It was only when someone retired did a studio need to hire someone else. So it wasn't really the way LA operated at the time, which was, studios didn't even really have engineers, so to speak. The top job was assistant engineer. Most clients were bringing in their own engineer. Or, if they asked the studio to provide one, that would be an additional personnel, and, the assistant would come with the studio. So, yeah, I mean, I had friends here, and so I wasn't really that bothered with the idea of taking a step backwards, because I saw how much more of an opportunity to move forward there was. And there was just more going on, and San Francisco only got worse from there. So in some ways I kind of dodged a bullet getting out when I did, because the city changed a lot, and for artists, not for the better.
Yep.
So yeah, here I was in LA. I started at Westlake, and kind of right off the bat, one of the things that I feel made me a little bit different and set me apart was my personality and my attitude. There's this thinking when you go to recording schools that they try to instill in you, and and a lot of studios that you're kind of this like subservient, oh yes, you know what I mean, and
Yep.
I mean you need to be respectful, you need to know your place, but at the same time, there's something to be said for just people who just seem like they're on the level. And, you know, without ever like really stepping out of place, I felt like I was just able to connect with, whether it was the producer or even the artist. It's just like them. Like Marilyn Manson was recording Mechanical Animals at Westlake when I started working there. And I had met them the summer before in Germany. They were headlining a festival with Faith No More. And so I was hanging out with Faith No More at the show, and like the backstage was in like little quads. And so their outdoor picnic space they had a common space with Marilyn Manson. So I was talking to Twiggy a bit at the time. And then, it was like 6 months later, no one in that band drove for probably very good reason. So, Twiggy needed a ride home, and he's like, "You look familiar." I was like, "Yeah, like, we met at this pop festival in Germany last summer with Faith No More." He's like, "Oh yeah, cool. Like, what are you doing?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I moved from San Francisco." And so it's like already just, could just have a conversation with someone. And I think there was a lot to be said for that. I mean, I would get mistaken a lot of times, when I was a runner, an assistant, an artist would just come up to me and I'd be wearing leather pants or whatever. And I'm not saying you should go and wear leather pants to get ahead in the industry, but it helps. People would just start talking to me. They'd think I was another client, and they would just want, "Oh yeah, what you working on?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm the assistant engineer." And they're like, "Oh, cool." But it didn't. People were, you could just clearly see that I just made myself,
Yeah.
available to people and emotionally available, and have a sense of humor. If people are joking, don't feel like you need to, not laugh at a joke. This was still the time of hazing, which I think we've moved past, luckily.
Yeah.
It's a very different time in the industry now, in some good ways, on that. But there was teasing, and I found that if you just tease back, you're accepted. And that was especially true with someone like Marilyn Manson. Like, he'd make a crack, and you just crack right back, and all of a sudden that was it.
Yeah, you're
you were in.
Yeah.
And it's when you kind of showed that vulnerability. I mean, there was a guy who worked there who, man, they took so much advantage of, because he just, he got sent, Marilyn Manson sent him for like some G.I. Joe astronaut action figure with the red boots at like 3 a.m. one night. It's like, "Oh, it's just come out, I got to have it." And like, you just made some shit up and, sent this kid out to go get it. And, it was funny.
Yeah.
Not going to lie.
But you have to, at some point, you gotta kind of stand up for yourself and just be who you are, not just like be that subservient person that you said, right?
Like, get the joke. I mean, Dave Sardi came in, years later. Marilyn Manson was working there again, and this time, I was actually the assistant on the session, and then, Dave Sardi was coming in to mix, and great mixer. I'd never worked with him before, and this is, very, very early on. We're still in the late 90s here. And, he's asking, like, he's like, "Oh, do you guys have a Cooper time cube?" I had never even heard of that. I was like, "What?" And so, I'm calling all the rental places, and like everyone's just like, "No, we don't have one of those." I mean, I figured out what it was. And so, I come back in, and I was like, "Oh, you'll never believe this, man. Design Effects has 6 of them, but they're all rented right now." And he's like, "What?" I'm like, "No, dude, no one's got one of those." I'm like, "Let me see." So then I go out to the parking lot, and I get like a traffic cone, and I put like Cooper time cone on a piece of tape, and I bring it on, and be like, "I have a Cooper time cone. Will this do?" And like, because there was a little bit like that. It was like he was being a little bit surly, and it was just like I literally was just throwing it right back, not showing that I was bothered by it, just like, that like he was asking me, like, "Can you find me a pair of ProAct monitors?" And I'm like, again, like no one was using those yet, and I'm looking everywhere. I'm like, "No one's got these." It's like, I'll just go get mine from home. I'm like, why didn't you just bring yours from home to begin with, dude?
Love it.
You know what they are. You know that no one else is using them yet. It's like still the 90s. Like, just bring yours.
Yep.
You know? I don't expect someone to go rent something for me that I know I have some weird little thing. Like, just bring yours.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think you bring up some really good points there. Just like, anyone who is like hesitant to make that move to a big city thinking they maybe have to downgrade or whatever, it just comes down to your attitude and just being friendly with people. Like, those are the things that make you stand out and that people are going to notice, and you're going to rise up faster if you're doing that, because people want to work with you more, and they want to see they see the value in what you offer. So that's really important.
And like I said, I think there was still value in starting in that smaller place because it gave me real experience early on that absolutely helped me move up that ladder in LA faster than I would have otherwise. There were a lot of people who right out of school started at Westlake, and like 5 years they were still runners. Yeah. Because they hadn't had the opportunity to learn yet. You had to kind of take the initiative and get into the rooms after hours, and you got to do that.
Absolutely. Well, I'd love to like talk a little bit more about your process currently when it comes to mixing, and like dive into that a little bit more. When it comes to starting a project, specifically with mixing, let's say, what's your mindset going into a mix? Like, what are you listening for? How do you start? Where do you start? Do you have a specific process you like to follow? What does that look like for you?
Well, I mean, more than anything, what I like to do is actually talk to the artist or the producer or, whoever wants to talk to me about it. Because I don't really feel like I have a thing, where like, oh, I'm just going to get it and I'm going to do my thing to it. I want to see what the artist or producer or everyone likes about it currently. I want to hear the rough. I always, as long as there is a Pro Tools session of the rough, I want that. I just want the rough mix session so that I can use it and move forward. I have a zillion plugins that I've collected over the years from doing this. Occasionally I'll get stumped and, I can either demo it and sub it out, or it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. Buy it, whatever it is. Like, I will get their session playing back, and then I'll start to put that into my template, because I have had situations in the past where, and like I said, there may be times where the rough mix wasn't done in Pro Tools. Maybe someone did something crazy and did a monitor mix in an analog studio, and that's the rough mix. Okay, fine. I'll start from scratch. But a lot of times, so much work has been put into the rough mix, and that's how people have been listening to it. And if it feels good, if there's something that people are already liking about that, like, I don't want to jump in and the first thing I do is screw that part of it up. I'm going to take it further, but like, as an extreme example, I did a mix one time for this artist, and the rough mix was rough. It was definitely rough. But it showed the song off in a way. And I knew I could do a better rough mix, but when I got the tracks, it was like the rough mix had this incredible distorted bass, like growling. I literally got a clean DI. And this guy had a bunch of really cool analog equipment. He recorded everything kind of DI because that's how, and then when he did the rough, he ran everything through stuff live, and then that rough mix was live through analog gear. But there were cool sounds on it, but like none of those sounds were printed individually. So when I got the tracks, it was like I had been given tracks to a different song. And not that I couldn't do something with it, but you're always second guess. Okay, so I'm going to distort the bass, and like, kind of like what you just spend like a whole day trying to match something that someone's already done once. And, if someone's got something cool, just give me something cool. I can make it better, but I don't want to try and like have to start by copying it, Yeah. I've already taken that step back, once. I don't want to start, it's like you're starting from behind the starting line when that's what's delivered to you.
Yeah.
And I can, and that's why I like the session as opposed to, just print all your effects and then just send me audio with all your printed effects, because I do very oftentimes take things off.
Yeah.
I don't want to only have one, raw or fully processed. I'll take something off. Maybe there's one thing you're doing that's cool and I'll take everything else off. Or maybe a whole chain of stuff is something I would have never thought to do because it maybe on paper is a bad idea, but I take it off and it doesn't sound as good as when it's on. Cool. Move forward. I don't have to spend time doing that. I can still make it better, but I don't have to make it worse first in order to make it better and lose time.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. It actually kind of ties into another question I had for you, because I was checking out your website and there was one line in your bio that kind of stood out to me. I'm just going to read it here. It said that you work closely with artists to distill a sound and style that's truly their own while challenging them to push their boundaries further. And, that's kind of like your ethos there, which is awesome. So, this kind of sounds like maybe what you're talking about, where you're kind of starting from like the sound that they've envisioned for themselves. And then in the mixing stage, you're probably going to push it further and do some cool stuff with it. But I'd love to dive into that kind of statement a little bit more and talk about like, what are some of those ways or methods that you like to use to try to push artists past their boundaries and push them maybe in a new direction? Yeah, well,
over my career, being in kind of more indie circles, I've worked with a lot of kind of genre bands over the years, whether it's like a particularly kind of goth band or like a punk band. And when I approach records like that, I don't really think of them within their genre. I think of, what is this band good at that people outside this niche might recognize? It's not to make a band less edgy or anything. I don't ever want to do that. But what could a band like this incorporate to sound like they've grown artistically? And usually, hopefully, it's that the band have already grown artistically before they get to me. I always like to see when I get demos in from a band and I listen to maybe something old and I'm like, oh, cool. I like this more than their last record. This is going to be fun. I've gotten demos before where I'm like, oh man, I wish it was more like their last record. Like I'm, not as into this. But, going forward, it may be, you're hinting at some melodies. Like, why don't we not bury that? You've written a great melody. Let's not try and obfuscate it with too many weird things, at the same time, let's give it a mood. I say I try to make bands more edgy and more sort of wider acceptance at the same time. And, it almost sounds like two opposite things. What makes this band weirder, but what makes them more endearing to more people at the same time? And a lot of times, maybe it's the weirdness. Like I said, making them more unique. Especially, like I said, genre bands where it's like they can very easily just all sound the same.
Yeah.
And, what's going to help them transcend that? There's certain bands that have kind of transcended genres in the past. Like you look at a band like Deftones, who, they are a new metal band. And I can't really say I like any other band of that genre from that era. But that band, right off the bat, was just so much cooler than all the rest. And they're still around and they're still really cool. I was never a big, like, hardcore fan, but Refused, when Shape of Punk to Come came out, people outside of that hardcore scene took notice because, it took that sound to a new place and did something unique. And actually that record was more weird. And because it was more weird, it made it more interesting to more people outside of the scene it came in. And so I think, while that's not a record that I made, I did go on to work with Refused later, but I think that's a good reflection of my ethos, like how you accomplish that, making something kind of, less normal, more interesting, and at the same time, more interesting to more people. Yeah. I mean, there's a band I worked with from San Francisco called Veil Veil Vanish, and we put a steel drum. They're a goth band. Like, we put a steel drum on the outro of a song. And we let the melodies come to the forefront. We made the drums like really banging so that, kind of a little bit heavier than they have been in the past. And, that's a record. It's so old now. I think I did that record in the 2000s. I'm going way back there, but it was still a record that, I guess for me, it was sort of like a creative peak at its time, certainly since then, I feel like I've accomplished higher levels since then, but it was something I was really proud of for a very long time. For, just the production of it, the mix of it at the time. Of course I listen to it now and I can, in 5 minutes I could do a 10 times better mix in 5 minutes if I sat down to it now, but that was 15 years ago. Of course.
Yeah.
Of course I could beat it now.
Yeah. But it's interesting because you talked about how one of the first things you do in your process is you go through that rough mix and how sometimes the rough mix has some of that gold in there. And it's also interesting because you talked about how maybe sometimes the band needs to lean into some of their weirdness, and especially these days when people are often making their own demos, sometimes that rough mix that you get has things buried in them because those are the artist's insecurities, right? It's maybe the vocalist is afraid of their voice and maybe they think it sounds weird, and so they bury it a little bit more, or the guitar player or whatever, whoever's mixing it will usually be the one musician who buries their tracks a little lower in the mix. But I think to then push it and to get it louder in the final product and to really showcase those things, it takes some sort of level of comfort to be able to convince an artist, lean into this. This is the cool stuff here. So when it comes to creating that comfort with an artist to make them feel excited to have that instrument showcased, what are some of the ways that you go about creating that comfort for them, or so they trust you with that?
Well, I think in some ways they trust my ear, which is why they've seeked me out in the first place. And so, honestly, sometimes it's just a matter of, I think your vocal could be this loud. And they're like, oh, well, if he thinks it should be that loud, then cool. And I don't really like the super, super loud vocal thing. I do, especially when I'm working with heavier music, it has to be balanced because you don't ever want it to sound like this giant band is being crushed by the vocal. Whereas, in some of the, I do a lot of jazz records alongside Larry Klein, and it's okay if the vocal is too loud on those. I don't know if you know the Rick Rubin vocal level theory, which is turn it all the way up, turn it up until it sounds too loud, and then turn it up 1 more dB.
Love it.
Yeah, you could take that or leave that tip. I just find interesting ways to feature parts. I was once sent a mix. There's a song by a group called, what are they called? French Style Furs, I think is the group. It was some members of Cold War Kids. And so I was mixing kind of, it was a very kind of self-made side project. And they had recorded in their rehearsal space. And songs were cool. There was this one song where the bass was just droning, and through the whole song, the snare wires were just rattling in the rooms, and they wanted this really ambient drum sound because some of the other songs, we were able to utilize those mics in the proper way, but I couldn't really utilize the ambient mics at all because it was just literally constant. That's it. Mm-hmm. There was no sound of drum in that, and I was like, oh, it's gonna be really difficult. That was a lot of the drum sound on the other songs. What am I gonna do? In the end, I ended up side chaining those room mics with the kick, and actually creating a musical part, and made the kind of swell because it was this really slow, dirgy song. The song's called something about Miami. French Style Furs. I think there's only one record and there's only one song with Miami in the name, if anyone wants to look up the song. But it's So I basically took this sound that was, for the most part, unusable, unusable in the way it was recorded, and made a musical part out of it. And now a drum part that was actually kind of boring because it was just like boom, cock, boom, cock. Now all of a sudden this huge noise swell happens. It's like, and now it's like literally the most important aspect of the mix is that swell, which I took from what may have been a completely unusable track, or at least unusable for what it was intended for.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's cool.
And so, just finding what's going to give a character and a personality and an emotion to the song. I mean, you hear a lot of people say that, but it really is true. The most important thing is a mix that makes you feel something. I mean, there's tons of records out there that are really cool and very musically cool and very emotional and fun to listen to that sound kind of technically bad. Like First Jesus and Mary Chain record, Psycho Candy, like that's real hard to listen to, but it's cool as hell, and I would much rather make a record like that than something that is just, there's a genre of bands that I call engineer rock now, that it's just like musically it's so boring and so lame. It just, sounds like they spent a lot of money dialing sounds and, maybe maybe spent a lot of money on gear and I'm not going to point any fingers, but there's a lot of two-piece bands in that genre.
Gotcha.
It's just like the music starts to sound like a commercial for pickup trucks because that's exactly the kind of music that you hear in commercials for pickup trucks.
Gotcha. Love it. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. Well, no, it's cool though. Like, and I love that example that you gave of like, kind of having that creative approach to using something that maybe wasn't the right track or wasn't a usable track. And,
Right.
but still finding something cool in there and making it unique for the artist. And it also ties into another question that I had for you, which was that, like when I listen to your records, one thing that really stands out to me is the way that you create depth and ambience in your tracks.
Yeah.
Like I think you do a great job of having things that are right in the forefront, and then there's like a bunch of other stuff that's pushed back. And like everything kind of has its own space. Like you could feel the 3D nature of your mixes, which is really cool. I really admire that. And so I'd love to talk about kind of how you achieve that. And to me, like one of the things that I was hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seemed like you tend to achieve that front to back kind of nature, not only by using volume, but also by the way that you use effects. And it kind of sounds like, to me, it sounded like you would give each instrument its own effect to kind of create its space in the song. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe you do share effects and stuff like that too. So yeah, maybe we could talk about that more.
I mean, specifically with sharing effects, I usually only share effects kind of like maybe within a family of instruments. And some of that is because in my current kind of template workflow makes it easier to separate stuff out. I find if I do want to try like, oh, let me try that same effect, say I have an effect on a guitar, I'm going to try it on a keyboard. I'm like, oh, that is cool. I'll just duplicate it and give the keyboard its own, even if it's doing the same thing. So it can go to keyboard land. It's like, I have a beast of a computer. Like, you know what I mean? If I want to have two of the exact same aux send or, effect returns, I can. It makes life easier for me, even if it is the exact same effect. It makes my life easier when it comes time to say do stems or whatever. But sometimes I'll start by sending it to the one, and if that is the right thing. But yeah, I mean, you're very much right. Utilizing different effects on different sounds helps. I mean, I would almost never send the vocal to the same effect that I have on an instrument. Not that it wouldn't be the same types of effects, just to make them a little bit different. Vocals, I actually have become to like a bit drier these days. that's maybe something I've picked up in a few years from, well, possibly working with idols. I mean, when I mixed Joy as an Act of Resistance, I actually got notes from the label while we were mixing that to dry up the vocal. Because I was, my take on it was making it maybe a little more, maybe in that British, maybe gothy thing. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I kind of had my Launay hat on when I was doing that because he was mixing, 3 songs on the album in the end. I did 12, and in the end, he was supposed to do 2, and I was like, dude, take one more off my hands. Take this one. It's got the most tracks. When I dried it up, it was a little bit alien to me, but obviously in hindsight, it was so the right thing to do, and I think that really informed the way we worked with the vocal on the next album, Ultra Mono, on how we recorded it and knowing how we mixed it, which was, you have a very, very commanding performance here, and you really just want to hear that performance. I mean, when I say dry, it's not totally dry. It's just that, the effects are more subtle. I mean, one thing that I've only just discovered, I'm a little late to the game on this. I got a mix in of a song where the rough had utilized some Bricasti presets in there's a Bricasti plugin. I forget what it's called. But they were like office and bedroom. And those things sounded amazing. It just absolutely nailed that natural intimacy without it just being off. Because, I mean, completely dry is awkward sounding. It sounds really awkward because real life doesn't sound like that. Unless you go in some weird chamber, which is really off-putting to be in that chamber and try and speak. So, it may be a very, very quiet slapback. It may be that kind of ambience. I use, sometimes I use a bit of a harmonizer to give us space without really it feeling like a time-based effect. And then, of course, distortion. Even if it's a parallel distortion or like a multi-band parallel distortion. I mean, one thing I do with vocals is a lot of times using FabFilter Saturn. I will make a 3-band module in Saturn and bypass the top and bottom, leave them completely clean, and only drive the mid-range. But then I also have an envelope follower on the amount of drive that's negative to input. So actually, as the singer sings louder, the drive is turning down. So it's pushing the quieter parts more. It's kind of balancing things out because, my idea, and I'll do this on like jazz records even, the idea isn't to make the singer sound like Al Jorgensen, when they yell. The idea is that they're already, as a human voice, as it sings louder, it's going to get more saturated. Your vocal cords naturally thicken and more overtones, much like distortion does as you sing louder, so you need less support. It's actually those quieter passages that stand to have a little automation sneaky. I mean, you don't ever want to balance it to the point that, like, what I hate vocals where it's been so balanced to the point that, like, there's a whisper and a scream and they're like at the same volume.
Yeah.
It's a sneaky thing. I've also heard the opposite where there's too much dynamic range. It's like, it's a sneaky thing and it should be something you don't notice. You lose yourself. And I think, that's another sign of a good mix is when you're listening to it and you're just bobbing your head and you forget that you're actually in a critical mode, and you're just grooving and you've forgotten to think about what could be better. And you're just like, oh, I'm tapping my foot, I'm bobbing my head. This may be almost done, Very cool. It's doing it. I mean, there's a certain point to where things can only, they can only go backwards.
Totally. Well, I love what you said there about just like trying to keep things sounding natural, but also, like still creating that ambience or whatever. And that example of using like bathrooms or whatever whatever it was, like the room sounds on the Percasti. Like that's a very cool effect, and that's something I love to do too. Like if I can, I'll try to like make impulse responses of bathrooms and studios, because I just love like recording gang vocals and stuff like that in those rooms, and I love leaning into that. And more often I find that like having that kind of effect on a vocal, on a lead vocal, for example, it just gives it like a unique character that you haven't heard before. It's not this big, long, drawn out like hall setting that just sounds too polished sometimes. It gives it enough of that depth so that it's not completely dry, but it's got some unique character to it. So I think it's cool that you mentioned that effect.
And I mean, we are kind of getting to this point where a lot of records are being made in bedrooms. And I think if the emotion that the artist is trying to convey, a sense of intimacy, that's actually a very inspiring place to make that kind of art. And if it suits the song, I want it to feel like it's in a bedroom. I mean, take a group like the XX, who I have to admit, I didn't get them at first. I was like, this sounds so undercooked to me. Like, I don't relate to it. And, but there was a point, and I don't know how long it took. I came around and was like, no, this is gorgeous. This sounds like it is intimate and real. And it sounds like it's recorded in a bedroom, because listen to the lyrics. They're things that you would say to someone in a bedroom. They're very, very personal. They're very intimate. And it's those relationships in cities, in apartment bedrooms that they're singing about. And so it actually is a gorgeous way to portray that music. And so I really, really dig that group. And, it's not the first time that I've gotten to really appreciate an artist that I didn't understand at first. I think sometimes those are the best artists when you don't get them right away.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
So then when it comes to like choosing effects to use, whether it's vocals or guitar or drums, whatever, how do you normally decide, what kind of effect you're going to use and when or when not to use those kind of effects?
Well, obviously the more kind of reverb or delay you put on something, it usually tends to push it away from your ears, into the distance. Now, a lot of times something I'll do is put a sound like maybe the dry sound hard one way and its effect mono but hard the other way, like maybe an echo on a guitar or something or whatever that is. And so I kind of go between like, part of me really likes to record parts with whatever effects they're going to have, like, oh, all these cool effects on the guitar. The problem is you can't then move the effect away from the dry guitar when it's committed at that point in the recording, so sometimes I'll go back and I'll be like, oh, you know what? As cool as that guitar sound is, I wish I would have like somehow recorded it separately or just taken a note of what it was and added it in the mix so that I could have that effect in a different place in the mix than the dry sound, if it's something that I recorded. If it's not something I recorded, then obviously I have what I have. But I mean, there's been times where I was kind of doing a fix and mix producing thing for this group, and they had recorded the songs on their own, and they were pretty cool. We kind of redid some things. We redid all the drums. We made them groovier. But the vocals were like these massive vocal stacks. It was kind of a dream pop thing with like a zillion tracks of vocals. And they were, already panned with effects and everything. And they'd done it in Ableton. So it was like, are we really going to re-record all this? Like, this is a ton of time. They had all the time in the world when they were at home by themselves to do it. And it had a vibe. But it was maybe a little too washed out. So I used it. But what I did was we recorded just one new vocal that we kept very dry. And because it was already stacks of vocals, it didn't matter that we were adding one more. But to be able to have that one dry vocal new in the center to just give a bit more definition to this really washy but very cool thing they had done, that was the trick to make that work. It's still very clear. There was a lot of reverb in their vocal stem that hadn't really been de-essed. So you had this massive, blooming sibilance in the reverb, which was a little bit. But what having the dry vocal allowed me to do was to kind of over DS the stem because, that would have sounded crap without the natural sibilance of the dry vocal that we recorded. And so that was, something, I guess, part of the recording process, knowing I was going to be mixing it. Yeah. So obviously, if you're just getting tracks in, that's not always an option to be like, oh, cool, let's just record a new lead vocal for the mix. Yeah, I mean, that's some of it is using spread and just really being able to really just place things, physically placing them. I do a lot of hard panning. I quite like that. And I might even have hard panning with a little bit of extra, magical widening, from some type of widening effect. There's tons of them out there. Obviously, you have to be, somewhat careful when you do that. If I could give some advice to people when using those kinds of things, don't employ a widening plugin and then pan the track back in from hard left and right. You will not, that is not a good result. I got something in recently that had some of that going on, and I was like, what's out of phase? And I start like muting things to try and see what's canceling. I literally, there's like one channel out of phase with itself because something has had a stereo widener on it, and then it's been panned, the channel's been panned in, and it's just like, no. That's one of the few times where I'm like, oh, I'm really glad I got this with the plugins on it, because that's got to go.
Yeah, I bet.
You either want it wide or you don't, but those
absolutely.
things are playing with phase. That's how they work. So they play with phase based on the assumption that your tracks are hard left and right. And as you start screwing with that, it's going to fall apart real quick.
Yeah, makes sense.
So tips for you guys out there that are experimenting with those. And that goes for the same with, something with like mid-side processing. Totally cool to use mid-side processing, but be aware that has to remain a fully stereo width channel, or
of course
you will get some weirdness.
Of course.
That was very strange. It's like, how is this out of phase with itself? Anyway, we got off on a tangent. What were we talking about?
No, it's all good. Yeah, we were just talking about like depth and ambience, and kind of how you create that effect, how you create that depth and that width using various effects. And one thing that I wanted to ask about as it relates to depth and ambience is, like, when it comes to your drums, like, you've got some really cool roomy drum tones on some of your mixes.
Yes.
And I'm curious to know, like, are you the type of person that when you're recording, you're leaning into like a lot of room mics, or like, what's your approach for getting the most out of recording drums and making the most out of a room?
Absolutely room mics. I mean, that's probably the number one engineering tip that I learned from Nick, was to capture the room. He's famous for records like PIL, like Flowers of Romance, those big, huge, massive 80s drum sounds. His mentor, he did that. Nick was the assistant on Coming in the Air Tonight by Phil Collins,
Wow.
That's where that comes from. The slammed SSL, talkback compressor thing, or 1176s, and sometimes we're using 57s on room mics. It's all about to give that sort of aggression when it's appropriate. Now, obviously that's gonna, you have to kind of work with drum parts that are going to be played. The faster a song is, the tighter you kind of need a room to be. It's always great if a drummer is open to overdubbing cymbals. And I've been lucky enough to actually have a lot of drummers ask to do that rather than it being something that I have to kind of force on them. They're like, hey, is it cool if we do this? I'm like, oh, yes, it's absolutely cool, because it just gives you a little more freedom to play with sound in an extreme way.
Yeah, that's like one of my favorite techniques for drummers is, just track the shells separate from cymbals because you have so much more control in the context of the mix, and you can slam the crap out of certain things and get so much more ambience out of the tracks, and it can just make your tracks sound really big. And I read that you guys did that with the Idols record, right? Ultra Mono, was that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we recorded that at La Frette outside of Paris, and the room where the drums was like an old wine cellar. It was basically like it was a curved ceiling. It was almost like the room was almost like a long half cylinder, so to speak. It was all brick. It was a great sounding room. We got amazing sounds in there. One of the only downsides to that was that utilizing that basement space of the studio for such a loud band being so close together, the guitar amps were like right on the other side of a single sliding glass door that couldn't even close all the way because there were cables going through it. So there is absolutely ambient miking going on those drums, and also cymbals being overdubbed. But I also took samples of the ambience. And so when there were times where I needed more ambience, but it was literally just like bringing up guitar bleed, I would trigger a sample, but I was triggering a sample of the same ambience in the room that we were in. Like on the song War, you really hear that on the snare, to really get those snares to, there's kind of, it starts off and there's like break where there's just like vocal and drums. And that's kind of like the natural sound of the room. And then when the guitars kick in, I'm triggering a sample. And so you maintain all that ambient kind of growl of the snare drum, which in reality during the, and it's a live take, during the tracking, like that ambience just was guitar noise.
Yeah.
So trying, sometimes you just have to work in the environment you're in and figure out ways around it. I mean, obviously a band like that, you want them to track live and you put everything where it best suits everything. And, that studio is fantastic. There's a lot of spaces upstairs where, were certainly ways to get more isolation between instruments, but there's such a loud band. I think we were a little self-conscious that, we were going to, for the first time, disturb the neighbors, like, oh, let's put the guitar amps upstairs, whereas like, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, that's why we were there. Launay had done a record with the Bad Seeds there, and a record like that, you can put Cave upstairs in the living room and play piano, and you can utilize the house and get a little more separation between us. And also they're, slightly more inspiring places for the musicians to be in the house other than that basement. But, we wanted the players in the room with the drums so that they could really feel. So, I mean, those guys are sure they're wearing good hearing protection because they're one of the loudest bands I've ever seen live. And they need to be. That's how they get their sound.
Absolutely.
They're incredible.
So you were talking about how sometimes you just have to make the most out of a room. And for the majority of people listening to this, they're working out of like basement studios or bedrooms or whatever, where they might not have that massive room that has that cool ambience to it. So do you have any tips there for like getting the most out of a smaller, more dry or intimate room?
Well, I guess it depends on the music you're trying to make. I mean, in some ways, very dry, tight drums are kind of more in vogue than big, roomy drums at the moment, given, depending on the band. But, and that's something that I've kind of gone back to as well, is trying to figure out like, let's do some different kind of things. I don't really like doing the same thing forever. But it's amazing, even in a small room, it's amazing what compression can give you the idea of. I mean, I've done drums in very, very tiny rooms before. And, you still have to think about where you're putting an ambient mic. I mean, but obviously may not be more than a couple feet away from the kit. But, if it's a bit splashy, put it down on the floor, I think there's an assumption a lot of times that ambient mics have to be high up in the air. And that's not really true anywhere. I mean, you can, but they don't have to be. I mean, very aggressive compression is just going to make an ambient microphone just sound like the space is bigger and bigger, because you're going to just hear more and more decay. Distortion is another thing too. And a lot of times that's, compression and distortion are somewhat interchangeable. There's a certain distortion to compression, and there's a natural compression to distortion. So again, if you really, really want that sound, find an ambient sample. I definitely tend to trigger samples more than I use actual, like, say, reverbs and things on drums. I have a little bit of a weird kind of like a distorted nonlinear reverb that I'll sometimes put on a snare, but again, it's not really a reverb sound. It kind of serves to give a little more of like the snare wire sound, like the ch, but also with a stereo spread. So like you don't, although I am using, a AMS RMX, nonlinear, but then it's going through kind of a delay to give it a stereo width, and then it's going through a distortion. Like, I still don't necessarily consider that like a reverb.
Gotcha.
It certainly sounds nothing like a reverb when you use it. That's a fairly 80s thing, that nonlinear, just to really give length to the sound of the snare drum itself, if that makes sense. To give it the sizzle.
Yeah, I love those like gated reverbs. Just they, to me, like drums on their own are just so dry and tight, and like. But I love like big sounding drums. So like a gated verb to me is the solution for that, definitely.
And I came up in the 80s and 90s, and that was the sound that inspired me. I definitely come from like a punk rock ethos, but I also love tastefully lush productions. I mean, records like Joshua Tree, they're such beautiful music, and it is certainly a slightly more intentional than just going in and bashing out a punk rock record.
That's cool. That's awesome. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but to kind of wrap it up, like my last question for you would just be, at the end of the day, what ultimately makes a great mix in your opinion?
Well, I think, like I said, it's whatever kind of takes you on a journey, and like I said, when you forget, as a producer mixer, I very often can be a bit critical when I'm listening to anything, but especially if I'm being tasked with listening to something critically, if I forget that I'm doing that while I'm listening, and I just find myself moving, if part of my body is physically moving, you're definitely onto something. And that's really more important than any real balance, or does the kick drum hit hard enough? Is there enough low end? I mean, yeah, we have to ask ourselves these questions when we're working. And, we hope to be able to do that part of the mix as efficiently as possible so that we can concentrate on the fun parts. But I think a great mix is one that forces an emotional response. Now, that also comes from a great song. A terrible song can't really have a great mix. It's all one thing. You can't really separate a song from a mix. When someone's listening, hopefully, they're just want to be taken on a journey, and they don't care how you achieved that. I think it's one. I mean, maybe it's one. A good mix is one that makes it feel like there's no curtain between the listener and the music. However you accomplish that. I mean, one of my pet peeves is noise, because I like to create this sense of intimacy, hiss and, electrical noise that I think a lot of people sometimes might find charming or whatever. I find that when I hear it, it exists in a space between me and the music. You know what I mean? Like it's it's not in the background, it's actually in the foreground. And especially, like hiss isn't there in real life. If you're trying to make the impression of like someone singing right into your ear, you may have had to create a lot of hiss to get that sound, but luckily we have things like RX. You obviously have to use them carefully, but I find that I don't find there to be a charm in analog noise or fake analog noise. You know what I mean? Like,
turn off all the damn analog buttons on the Waves plugins.
Oh yeah, turn off the analog buttons on the Waves plugins. Sometimes it's just a matter of like, I don't need to RX the whole track, but like there's some moment in the song where things go real quiet and I'll just like, let me just RX this 1 second, just so that when it drops down, it's so exposed. And that's just me. That's a pet peeve. Maybe a lot of people aren't bothered by that. Maybe that's not the most interesting thing in a mix, but I find that when I hear it, I find that it exists in a space between me and the music, and that's why I try to kill it.
Absolutely. And I think that silence can be such a powerful tool to create that impact when something finally does kick back in. So I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of people just think, it just sounds natural to have like your amp like hissing a little bit. And it's like, no, but then you lose that impact because you have this thing there.
I mean, I don't mind like if the idea is like, like the start of the Idols record is like someone plugging in and the amp hiss before they start playing. Like that's cool.
That's intentional.
Like that's intentional. You know what I mean? Like I don't mind an intentional noise. But those things they are additive, and it's like, if everything's making noise, then you don't notice that one of them is cool. You're just like, Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense.
But, again, that only pertains to certain things, I think,
Absolutely.
It's not as important as emotion. It's just something that distracts me personally.
Yep, 100%. Dude, this has been great. I've loved learning more about your process and your thoughts on all this stuff. If people want to learn more about you or maybe follow you online or maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, probably Instagram, really. I think my handle is a.atom.g, or you can go to atomgreenspan.com.
Awesome.
That's a fairly up-to-date website. Fairly. And you can find me there.
Right on, man. Thanks again for doing this. This has been awesome.
Sure thing.
So that was my interview with Adam Greenspan, and I really enjoyed learning more about his process. And I thought it was really interesting to hear more about how he likes to approach pushing the boundaries of an artist and how he sometimes likes to lean into the rough mixes that he gets from artists and kind of find the gold nuggets in there and emphasize those in a mix. I think that that's a really cool approach. I also thought it was really interesting to learn more about his approach to adding effects and creating width and depth. Like, now that you've heard this episode and you've heard some of the techniques he's talked about, go to his website and listen to his portfolio, and you'll start to pick up on the fact that each of the instruments in his mixes will have its own effect. And you can kind of hear what he was talking about, how he likes to give each instrument its own character, but also how he sometimes likes to pan effects and stuff like that. And it's just a really cool approach to creating clarity in a mix, but also still giving you that depth and ambience as well. And lastly, I thought it was great that he talked about the point of eliminating noise on your tracks, because it's one of those things that most people tend to just ignore it. They think, that's just part of the recording. It's just like there's nothing being sung or nothing being played. So, we're not going to hear anything. But you'll get hiss from your amps, or you're going to get hiss from your analog gear or stuff like that. And so I love that he talked about just cutting that out and how you can really leverage that to create more impact when stuff kicks in again. And, that can go a really long way. Silence is sometimes one of the most powerful tools you have while mixing. So I definitely want to say thanks again to Adam for being on the podcast, and thank you for listening to this podcast as well. And if you're currently working on new music and you're feeling stuck with it, if you're not quite hitting the mark of where you want to be with your songs, if you're not sure what you should be using to get your track sounding as good as your favorite records, or maybe you're just kind of in your head and you're second guessing everything and doubting whether it even sounds good enough to release, I would love to give you some feedback on your mixes and give you a very clear step-by-step process so that you can actually achieve the results that you're after.
If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude. And on that page, you can find all the details about my Amplitude coaching program. And in that program, I work one-on-one with my students to make sure that you're getting the results you want with your mixes. And in that program, we're literally listening to your tracks, making you personalized custom videos to show you exactly what you need to do within your tracks so that there's no confusion, there's no overwhelm. And in that program, we're literally working with you as you work on your mixes, listening to your tracks, giving you feedback, making you personalized custom videos to walk you through that process. We're eliminating all of the guesswork so that you're no longer stuck at home feeling lost and wondering what to do. Instead, we make this very clear so that you can get your songs done, get them sounding awesome, be proud of the results that you have, and ultimately release more music. So once again, if you're interested in learning more about this program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much again for listening to this one, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.